Aubrey Langston's rental car died on a two-lane highway outside Halcott, Vermont, with no cell signal and 73 minutes left before a meeting that might be the only chance to save everything she had spent 11 years building. She had driven herself from Burlington Airport rather than arranging a car service, because the letter she carried demanded absolute discretion, thick paper stock, a notary's embossed seal in the corner, no signature beyond the attorney's stamp, and a single instruction she had read 6 times on the flight from Chicago: bring no assistance, tell no one. The letter had arrived 11 days ago at her private address, not her office, and it had summoned her to an estate called Vanderhouse, on Hollow Creek Road, in the hill country north of Brattleboro, before 5 o'clock that afternoon. She had understood without being told that whatever waited at that address held something Langston Energy Solutions could not survive without. The hood release stuck on the first pull. She wrestled it open with both hands and stood in the thin October wind, staring at an engine that told her absolutely nothing useful. Cold air carried the smell of wet pine and distant wood smoke. The hazard lights blinked with mechanical indifference at the empty road. She had tried her phone 4 times. Nothing. The hills on either side rose steeply enough to swallow every bar she had. Aubrey Langston had run a clean energy company through 2 recessions, a hostile acquisition attempt, and a board coup she had outmaneuvered by 36 hours. She was not a woman who panicked, but standing on that gravel shoulder watching minutes disappear, she felt the very particular helplessness of someone whose resources meant nothing, without a working vehicle and a phone that could reach anyone at all. She heard the truck before she saw it, a low diesel rumble coming down from the ridge, slowing as it rounded the curve. An older Silverado, white with rust along the wheel wells, a magnetic decal on the door reading Malloy Electrical in plain block letters. The man who climbed out wore a canvas work jacket and boots that had seen more than one winter. He crossed the road at an unhurried pace, glancing once at the sky with the quiet assessment of someone accustomed to reading weather, and introduced himself simply. Griffin Malloy. He said he could take a look if she wanted, and did not wait for her to agree before crouching beside the open hood. Within 2 minutes, he had traced the failure to a power relay controlling the fuel delivery system. He explained it in plain, measured language, not simplified, not performed, and told her it was the kind of fault that resembled a dead battery but wasn't, and that it could not be repaired roadside with what either of them had available. She almost corrected him before she caught herself, because the explanation was technically exact, in a way she had not expected from a man who drove an electrical contracting truck on a back road in Vermont. She asked if he might drive her to her appointment. Griffin checked the time, said he was already running late for something himself, and agreed anyway. Aubrey climbed into the passenger seat of the Silverado and settled her coat around her knees. The cab smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. On the back seat, a child's watercolor painting had been carefully slipped into a clear protective sleeve. A blue house with an enormous orange sun, the name Nell written across the bottom in the uneven capitals of a child learning to be proud of her own handwriting. A travel mug sat in the cup holder, its lid on crooked the way a lid goes on when someone is running behind because they put a child's lunch together first. She did not ask about any of it. But something in the small accumulation of those details softened a part of her she had not intended to bring to this meeting. Every 4 minutes, she looked at her watch. When she offered him $300 to drive faster on the wet curves, Griffin Malloy declined without irritation, saying only that no appointment was worth what could happen if the truck went sideways on wet leaves on a steep grade. The flatness of his certainty unsettled her more than an argument would have. She told him, more sharply than she meant to, that he could not possibly understand what was at stake. He said that stakes and speed were not the same thing, and turned his attention back to the road. She was composing a response to that when her phone caught a signal for the first time since Burlington, a single bar, flickering. 2 messages from Philip Daunt, her chief financial officer, arrived at once. The first said Morton Crew had already reached the estate with his legal team. The second said, "Sign whatever they put in front of you. We cannot afford to lose Crew's bridge financing. Do not let an unknown variable derail this." She stared at the phrase unknown variable for a moment, recognizing it as Philip's way of saying he did not trust her judgment when the numbers were this close to the edge. Beside her, Griffin Malloy's hands shifted almost imperceptibly on the wheel at the sound of Morton Crew's names spoken aloud. She caught the movement. She was a woman who noticed things for a living, and she filed it away. She asked where he was headed. Instead of answering, Griffin reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a sealed envelope. The paper was identical to hers, the same weight, the same pale ivory stock. The embossed seal in the corner bore the initials EV, pressed into wax the color of old brass. Aubrey read the address printed on his envelope aloud. Vander House, Hollow Creek Road, Halcott, Vermont. Griffin eased his foot off the accelerator, as though the coincidence itself required physical caution. He asked her to repeat it. When she did, he pulled the Silverado onto a gravel turnout, cut the engine, and opened his own envelope. He held it out so she could see the matching date, the matching time, the matching seal. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Aubrey's first instinct was the practical one. Morton Crew had placed this man along her route. Someone had disabled her rental and arranged for a cooperative stranger to intercept her, to gather information, or simply to ensure she arrived off balance and indebted to a person serving Crew's interests. She had seen subtler maneuvers from Crew's firm before. Griffin seemed to read the calculation forming behind her eyes. He handed the envelope across without a word and let her examine it as thoroughly as she needed. The notary's mark matched. The attorney's signature matched. The verification code, running along the bottom edge, matched the one she had memorized from her own copy on the flight. The only difference was in how each letter addressed its recipient. Hers named her as the commercial steward of the Vander estate. His named him as the technical custodian, a designation she had never once encountered in a decade of reading acquisition documents and licensing agreements. She handed the envelope back. He restarted the truck. The iron gates of Vander House came into view through a curtain of thinning rain. Beyond them, a row of black SUVs sat in the circular drive like a statement of intent. Griffin guided the Silverado through the gates and parked it between 2 vehicles whose combined value exceeded what his electrical contracting business likely earned in 3 years. A member of the estate's security staff approached immediately, addressed him as the delivery driver without asking, and directed him toward the service lane along the side of the building. Griffin said quietly that he had been invited. The guard stepped back. Morton Crew emerged from the estate's front entrance a moment later, silver-haired, tall, his overcoat the kind that costs more than politeness requires. He greeted Aubrey by name with a warmth engineered to suggest they were already on the same side, then turned to Griffin and produced a folded bill from his coat pocket. He pressed it forward with the particular condescension of a man who has confused his net worth for his intelligence, and suggested the truck would be more comfortable, parked around back with the staff vehicles. Griffin did not take the money. Crew laughed pleasantly and remarked to Aubrey, in a quiet aside not quiet enough, that it appeared someone had tried to attach himself to her arrival under a false pretense. He suggested she had simply been too gracious to say so. Aubrey said nothing. The silence sat uneasily in her chest, even as it was happening. Philip Daunt appeared at Crew's shoulder then, and something passed across Philip's face at the sight of Griffin Malloy. A compression, quick and involuntary, gone before it could be named. He leaned toward Crew and said something too low for the others to hear. Crew's expression smoothed into something careful. He instructed the security staff to remove Griffin from the property. Two men started across the gravel. The estate's front door opened. A woman in a gray wool suit stepped out with the unhurried authority of someone who has never needed to raise her voice to be obeyed. She walked directly to Griffin Malloy, extended her hand, and introduced herself as Cecily Oram, attorney for the Vander estate. She announced, at a volume that reached everyone on the drive, that the proceedings could not begin without Griffin Malloy's presence, that his role was not incidental, but central to the entire matter, and that anyone who interfered with his entry to the property would be in direct violation of the terms of Edmund Vander's will. The two security men stopped. Crew's smile did not disappear, it simply recalibrated. Cecily gestured toward the open doors, and the group moved inside. The estate's library had books on 3 walls that looked like they had actually been read. Cecily Oram took her position at the head of the room, opened a leather document case, and explained that Edmund Vander had recorded a final statement to be played only when both designated recipients were present together in the same room. The recording was not polished. Edmund Vander had filmed himself in a hospital room in the kind of afternoon light that belongs to places where people are waiting for something they cannot prevent. His voice was steadier than his hands. He said he had kept a silence for 6 years that he should have broken on the morning it began. 6 years ago, a distributed grid management system called GridLink, a design capable of coordinating microgrid networks across an entire region and reducing energy distribution losses by nearly 1/3, had been developed at his company, Vander Systems, by a lead engineer named Griffin Malloy. A cascade failure in a pilot installation in upstate New York had caused a regional blackout lasting 19 hours. Griffin had been blamed. His engineering license had been suspended pending investigation. His career had ended the following Thursday, when Vander Systems released a public statement that did not defend him. Edmund Vander said, in the steady voice of a man addressing something he could no longer carry, Griffin Malloy had not designed the flaw that caused the failure. Edmund had known that when it happened. He had remained silent because Morton Crew's investment firm had been weeks away from committing $50 million to Vander Systems, and Crew had made clear, in language deniable enough to repeat nowhere, that any public dispute over the incident's cause would end the partnership before it began. Griffin sat very still through the recording. He kept his eyes on the screen with an expression that carried something older and heavier than anger. The particular exhaustion of a man hearing confirmed what he had always known was true, but could not prove to anyone who mattered. The terms of the will followed. Griffin Malloy would be named technical custodian of GridLink, holding sole authority over the system's engineering standards, its safety certification process, and any technical modifications before deployment. Aubrey Langston would be named commercial steward, responsible for bringing GridLink to market under terms she determined appropriate. Neither party could license, sell, or activate GridLink without the written agreement of the other. If no agreement was reached within 24 hours, ownership of GridLink would transfer automatically to an independent engineering trust, where it would remain inaccessible to any commercial entity for a minimum of 8 years. Morton Crew offered Griffin $40 million for his custodial rights, before Cecily Oram had finished translating the legal language into plain English. Griffin said no. The simplicity of it seemed to unsettle Crew more than any counter-offer would have. Aubrey felt the panic rising behind her composure. Langston Energy Solutions had 11 weeks of operating capital left, a number she had not shared with her full board. She needed GridLink. She needed it now, and the man currently holding the other half of that future had just turned down $40 million, as though the number were a mild inconvenience. She pressed him quietly whether he intended to use his authority as a form of retribution against a company that had inherited someone else's silence rather than created it. Griffin told her he would not sign any licensing agreement until GridLink's safety had been independently verified, not fast-tracked on Crew's preferred timeline, and until the record of what happened 6 years ago was corrected publicly rather than absorbed into another private arrangement. Philip Daunt appeared at Aubrey's elbow then, speaking in the low register he used when the numbers were bad. He told her that Crew's firm would extend Langston Energy's debt by 18 months if she could move things forward without Griffin's involvement becoming a complication. He placed a document on the table in front of her, a liability structure that would shift full technical accountability for any future GridLink failure onto Griffin Malloy alone, removing the company and its financial officers from exposure. Aubrey read it once. She read it a second time. She set it down without picking up the pen. She recognized the shape of what she was looking at. She had not expected to recognize it as clearly as she did. Cecily Oram led Aubrey and Griffin down a narrow staircase behind a hinged panel in the study wall. The laboratory below was sealed and temperature-controlled, its air carrying the stillness of a space that had been maintained with a specific purpose in mind. Server banks ran along one wall. At the center of the room, a working GridLink prototype sat connected to an isolated network, a test installation that had never been powered on outside this room. Griffin typed the startup sequence from memory. His hands did not hesitate over a single character. Screens came to life around them in sequence, and Aubrey watched a man who was supposed to be a small-town electrician move through a system architecture with the ease of someone who had written its original blueprints. She did not say what she was thinking. She stopped being surprised by anything he knew. They worked for nearly 2 hours. Aubrey brought her command of production timelines and regulatory frameworks, while Griffin traced every system component through its version history. They disagreed twice, once about review pace, once about the threshold for field testing before regional deployment, and neither of them conceded what they refused to concede, and somewhere in the middle of that, something shifted. Not warmth exactly, recognition. Deep in an archived modification log, Griffin stopped mid-sentence. He turned the screen toward her and walked her through it carefully. A set of parameter changes had been committed to GridLink's load-balancing algorithm 14 months after Griffin's departure from Vander Systems. The changes optimized for peak throughput metrics at the cost of thermal buffer margins, exactly the kind of modification that improved performance on paper and introduced a failure mode that would only appear under sustained real-world conditions. The same failure mode as Griffin demonstrated with 3 lines of comparison code that had caused the blackout 6 years ago. The commit had been authenticated under credentials registered to Philip Daunt. Aubrey's mind refused the information once before it settled. Philip had been at Langston Energy for 12 years. He had been present at the board meeting where she had taken over from her uncle. He had stayed through every crisis she could name. Griffin said, without emphasis, that the evidence was persuasive but that a portion of the surrounding logs remained encrypted. Persuasive was not the same as legally sufficient. He suggested they copy the files immediately. They were back upstairs with the drive in Griffin's jacket pocket when the laboratory went dark. Not the whole estate, just the corridor and the room they had come from, a targeted outage that left the rest of the house lit without interruption. Crew moved immediately, declaring loudly that the failure demonstrated GridLink was too technically unstable for a custodian of Griffin Malloy's apparent competence to manage responsibly. Griffin examined the circuit panel near the corridor door and found a small suppression device tucked behind an access cover, the kind of targeted hardware that required floor plan knowledge rather than luck. The drive was gone from his jacket. The hallway camera nearest the laboratory showed a 9-minute gap in its recording. Philip Daunt said he had been on a private call during that window and produced no log, no record, and no explanation that held together under a second question. Aubrey accessed Philip's corporate financial accounts remotely using her executive override credentials. The payment trail took 11 minutes to locate and 40 seconds to understand. A shell company registered in Delaware, receiving transfers from an account 2 intermediaries removed from Morton Crew's investment firm. The payments ran back 4 years. When Philip attempted to leave the estate, citing an urgent family matter, Cecily Oram stopped him at the door under an asset preservation clause in the will's terms. It was Griffin who located the missing drive, not inside Philip's case, not anywhere in the house. In the battery compartment of a vehicle in Morton Crew's private parking space outside, found through a radio frequency that Griffin had built into every data storage device he designed, a precaution he had adopted years before he imagined ever needing it. Crew stated immediately that someone had planted the evidence to frame him. His composure remained intact. His legal teams did not. Griffin explained without theatrics that the transmitter embedded in the drive had been logging its own location continuously since activation in the laboratory. The log showed the drive moving from the lab through the corridor and into Crew's vehicle within a 17-minute window. The log contained no gaps. The estate went quiet after that. Cecily Oram sealed the grounds and coordinated with a state police liaison she had apparently anticipated requiring. Crew and Philip Daunt were in separate rooms with separate counsel. Griffin stepped outside to the stone wall along the edge of a garden left to grow in without anyone minding. He called his daughter. Aubrey was passing the side doorway on her way back to the library. She could hear his voice but not the words, a low, even register calibrated to carry nothing alarming. She stopped without meaning to. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Griffin stood for a moment with the phone in his hand and the garden quiet around him, and in that stillness she understood that the composure she had been reading as indifference all evening was something different. It was the kind of steadiness that costs something to maintain, day after day, when a person has already lost most of what they were protecting. She went inside. The final audio file recovered from the drive was not something either of them had expected to find. A recorded meeting from 6.5 years earlier. 4 voices. Edmund Vanders was recognizable from the video played earlier. Crew's carried its characteristic unhurried confidence. Philip Daunt's was present, agreeing to things in the careful language of a man who understood the conversation, would never be admissible anywhere that mattered. The 4th voice belonged to James Langston, Aubrey's predecessor, her uncle, the man who had taught her to read a balance sheet at 14 and handed her the company at 31 with the instruction to protect what they had built. James Langston's voice said, in the clipped and businesslike register, she had heard in 100 phone calls over 100 difficult decisions that he understood Malloy had been cleared in the internal review. He said it anyway. He said it did not alter what the public statement required. He said a clean resolution would protect the partnerships that needed protecting, and he said he was prepared to allow the finding to stand. Aubrey kept her hands flat on the table while the recording ended. Griffin did not react the way a man reacts to a vindication. There was no relief in his expression. He looked only tired, in the way that becomes visible in people who have carried something very heavy for a very long time and have simply stopped expecting to be allowed to set it down. Morton Crew recognized the silence that followed as an opening and moved to it with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years finding doors in walls. He told Aubrey that if the recording became public, neither her family's name nor her company's fragile standing would survive the week intact. He offered a clean path. The recording would be managed, the contract would be signed. That evening, Gridlink would proceed on his timeline. Griffin would receive a private settlement. Everyone would be protected. Griffin said he would not participate in another private settlement. Aubrey looked at the document she had not signed an hour earlier, still sitting at the edge of the table where Philip had left it. She said that a company saved by burying the thing it was built on was not saved. It was only delayed. She said she had watched it happen to better-run organizations than hers, and that she was not going to learn that lesson again from the inside. Crew told her that Langston Energy's credit lines would begin unwinding by morning. She said she understood. He left the room. The emergency board call began at 11:47 that night, conducted from the estate's study with Cecily Oram present and Philip Daunt suspended from his position pending regulatory referral. Crew joined remotely and spent the first several minutes of his speaking time attempting to frame Griffin Malloy as a disgruntled former employee seeking leverage against a company that had moved on. Two board members asked, in succession, why the future of a company of Langston Energy's scale should depend on a man who, by the public record, had overseen a failed installation and lost his engineering license as a result. Griffin answered those questions himself. He walked the board through the original grid-link architecture, showed them where the modification had been introduced after his departure and under whose credentials, and demonstrated, using design documentation Edmund Vander had preserved in the sealed laboratory, that the unaltered system had cleared every safety threshold before it was changed. He spoke without drama. He made no demands. He simply showed them what was true and let them look at it. Cecily Oram presented the original patent filings establishing Griffin Malloy as GridLink's lead architect, the employment records, and the explicit terms of the will. She presented the payment records Aubrey had recovered from Philip's accounts. She presented the location log from the recovered drive. Aubrey followed with the restructuring proposal she and Griffin had drafted between 11 and 2 in the morning on pages pulled from a desk in the estate's study. GridLink would be licensed to Langston Energy under safety standards Griffin specified, with an independent audit board composed of engineers he approved. A defined percentage of forward revenue would be directed toward protecting jobs at the company's manufacturing facilities. The company's dependency on Crew's financing would end that day, replaced by an investor coalition Cecily Oram had been quietly assembling on Edmund Vander's behalf for nearly a year. 3 board members who had arrived on the call inclined toward Crew, left it voting the other direction. The motion to remove Aubrey from her position failed. Morton Crew lost his standing among the company's creditors before the sun came up over the Vermont hills. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of legal and institutional processes, slowly, without spectacle, but with the steady irreversibility of things that cannot be walked back once they have been set in motion. Griffin Malloy was formally cleared of every finding related to the blackout. The public record was corrected. His engineering license was reinstated. His name appeared on GridLink's documentation in the place it had always belonged. Philip Daunt faced federal charges related to financial fraud and corporate data manipulation. Morton Crew's investment firm became the subject of an SEC inquiry that extended to 3 other companies and had nothing to do with GridLink and everything to do with how Crew had preferred to operate for 30 years. Aubrey Langston called a press conference and stood before cameras to acknowledge her uncle's role in the silence that had cost Griffin Malloy 6 years of a career and a reputation he had done nothing to deserve losing. The admission cost her in the short term. Over the following weeks, it returned something she had not realized. Her company had been missing the trust of people who worked there and had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone in that building to say a true thing out loud. Griffin declined every offer that arrived in the months after. An executive title, a named position on the technical board, a research fellowship from a university that contacted him after his clearance became public. He accepted the role of independent safety arbiter for GridLink's deployment, a position structured around a schedule that left him free to pick up his daughter Nell from school every afternoon. He kept the electrical contracting business. He kept the Silverado. 4 months after the night at Vanderhouse, Aubrey Langston drove herself to a job site in the hill country north of Burlington, where Griffin Malloy's crew was completing a grid installation for a small rural cooperative. She arrived in a car with nothing wrong with it, engine quiet, no warning lights, no reason to stop on any shoulder anywhere. She told him so, standing in the gravel lot while his crew loaded equipment into the back of the Silverado. She said there was nothing broken today. She said she had not been able to find a better reason to make the drive, and so she had stopped trying to find one. Griffin looked at her for a moment. Nell was sitting on the tailgate with a library book, paying them no attention with the practiced nonchalance of a child who has decided to be very interested in something else. He asked Aubrey where she wanted to go. She named the address they both knew. Vanderhouse on Hollow Creek Road, which had since been converted into a grid engineering research and training facility. Griffin's name appeared above the entrance in letters the same size as Edmund Vander's. The facility ran a fellowship program for young engineers from rural communities, and Aubrey sat on its advisory council. Griffin smiled at the address, quietly, the way a person smiles at something that used to carry weight and now carries only its own meaning. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. The first time Aubrey Langston had climbed into that truck, she had no other option left. The second time, she chose it before she even had the chance to need it, and for both of them, that made all the difference.